Mason Walker stepped out of his dusty, weathered pickup truck, the tires crunching against the smooth pavement in front of Riverside Aviation's showroom. His sun-tanned skin bore the marks of long days under the scorching sun, and his clothes, a faded flannel shirt, worn jeans, and mud-streaked boots, spoke of his life working the land. Mason, a black farmer, wasn't here for the looks or the luxury. He was here for something bigger. Today, he intended to take the first step toward realizing a lifelong dream, buying his own private jet. Mason shoved his hands into his pockets as he walked toward the showroom doors. Inside, sleek aircraft lined the glossy marble floor like trophies on display, their polished surfaces reflecting the bright overhead lights. The room carried the sterile scent of wealth, a place where deals worth millions were closed with the flick of a pen. Mason's boots echoed as he stepped forward, each stride catching the attention of staff and customers. But instead of curiosity, Mason felt the cold weight of judgment. Suits and designer dresses turned, eyes narrowing. Near the entrance, a young man in a neatly pressed blazer and shiny loafers, probably the manager, arched an eyebrow, exchanging a glance with one of the sales associates. A woman near the reception counter whispered to the person beside her, the words barely audible but unmistakable. "Is he lost? He looks like he just came from a barn." A soft chuckle followed. Mason felt the heat of their stares, but his gaze didn't waver. He had long grown used to these looks, but he refused to let them define him. He approached one of the smaller jets, its silver exterior gleaming under the bright lights. Mason ran his calloused fingers along the cool metal, marveling at the craftsmanship. To him, this wasn't just an airplane. It was the culmination of years of sweat, toil, and relentless perseverance. In the far corner of the room, a group of well-dressed customers exchanged glances, their quiet murmurs growing louder. "What's he doing?" A middle-aged man grunted, loud enough for Mason to hear. "Maybe he's just here to pretend he can fly." Mason's hand paused on the jet's wing. His fists clenched briefly before he let out a breath, releasing the tension. He wasn't about to leave. This was his dream, and he had every right to stand there, just like anyone else. Across the room, Liam Preston, one of the lead salesmen, watched Mason closely. Liam's hair was slicked back, and his tailored suit fit him like a glove, the kind of polished appearance that matched the showroom's clientele. His eyes narrowed as he took in Mason's rugged clothes and weathered boots. Liam didn't hide his disdain. With slow, deliberate steps, Liam strode toward Mason. Each click of his heels against the floor echoed with unspoken authority. His lips curled into a smirk as he stopped a few feet away, arms crossed. "Excuse me," Liam said, his voice laced with mockery. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Mason glanced over his shoulder but said nothing. Liam's gaze drifted from Mason's faded cap down to his muddy boots. "This isn't a used tractor lot, you know," Liam added, smirking. "We sell aircraft here. Real ones. Maybe you'd have better luck at the junkyard across town." Mason's eyes met Liam's, calm and steady. His silence wasn't weakness. It was deliberate. Mason had faced far worse than this, and he wasn't about to let a salesman's arrogance shake him. He kept his hand on the plane, grounding himself in the quiet strength of his dreams. Liam, sensing no immediate reaction, took a step closer, invading Mason's personal space. "Look," Liam continued, his voice dropping. "These planes aren't cheap. They're for people who actually have the means. I'm just trying to save you the trouble." The insult lingered in the air, sharp and cutting. Mason let it hang there, refusing to give Liam the satisfaction of a response. Near the entrance, a woman in an expensive dress leaned toward her companion. "He probably thinks this is some kind of giveaway," she said with a soft laugh. Another customer, an older gentleman with silver hair, chimed in with a chuckle. "Maybe he's looking for a job polishing the planes." The showroom filled with quiet snickers. Mason heard every word, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deep breath, reminding himself why he was there. Turning his attention back to the jet, Mason let his hand trail across the smooth surface. It wasn't the mockery that filled his mind. It was the image of flying high above the fields he had worked for so many years. Liam, however, wasn't finished. "So should I call someone to show you the way out?" Liam asked, the smirk never leaving his face. Mason finally turned to face him, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to look," Mason said, his eyes locking onto Liam's. "I'm here to buy." Liam's smirk faded for a brief second, but it returned just as quickly. "Right," Liam said with a chuckle. "And I'm sure you've got a check ready too." Mason didn't answer. He didn't need to. As Liam turned away, Mason stayed right where he was, his resolve unshaken. Little did Liam know, this day would mark the beginning of a much bigger lesson. One that neither he nor anyone else in the room would soon forget. Mason Walker stood firm, his fingers trailing over the sleek, cold surface of the jet's control panel. The weight of Riverside Aviation showroom pressed down on him, not from its grandeur, but from the silent barrage of ridicule swirling through the air. Every step he took was shadowed by murmurs and subtle smirks. Yet Mason kept his focus locked on the plane before him, his dream, standing just inches away. Across the room, Liam Preston's smirk lingered, twisting as if Mason's calm demeanor was some sort of affront. Liam thrived in environments like this, dealing with sleek-suited executives flashing luxury watches and discussing business over cigars. A man like Mason, dressed in worn clothes and stained boots, didn't fit the script Liam was accustomed to. From the far side of the room, a woman leaned toward her friend by the window, her voice hushed but audible enough. "He looks like he just stepped off a tractor. Does he even know where he is?" Mason heard the words but didn't react. He was used to whispers like this. Instead, he inhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle in his chest, grounding himself. Liam took Mason's silence as victory. His confidence swelled, dripping from his words. "Do you even want to know the price of this plane?" Liam drawled, dragging out the syllables as if explaining rocket science to a child. "I'd hate for you to waste our time." Mason's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm. "I'm not here to waste anyone's time," Mason replied softly. Liam's smirk widened, but behind it was an edge, a flicker of frustration that Mason wasn't crumbling under his condescending stare. The tension hung in the air, thick and unrelenting. Near the reception desk, another customer, a woman in an expensive navy dress, crossed her arms and muttered to a man beside her. "He's probably just here to take selfies. Thinks it's some kind of raffle." The older man chuckled, nodding. "Bet he thinks he can fly one just by touching it." Laughter rippled through the showroom. Mason could feel their stares boring into his back. Some customers looked away when his gaze met theirs, but the damage was already done. The room's collective disdain felt almost suffocating. A young man near the counter glanced at Mason's boots and scoffed. "Look at him," he said, voice raised slightly. "Dressed like that? He really thinks he belongs here?" More laughter followed, louder this time. Another customer, a man with thick-rimmed glasses and graying hair, shook his head. "Maybe he's here for a cleaning job. I'd let him shine my jet." The words hung heavily, sharper than knives. The quiet remarks Mason could ignore, but this was different. The undertone wasn't just mockery, it carried the weight of something deeper. Mason kept his expression steady, though inside, each insult scraped at his pride. His knuckles whitened as his hand clenched into a fist at his side. But he didn't lash out. Instead, Mason took another deep breath, letting it out slowly. Losing his temper would hand them exactly what they wanted, confirmation that he didn't belong. He took a step forward, approaching another employee near the corner of the showroom. But before Mason could speak, Liam reappeared, cutting him off with a smirk that felt colder than the marble floor beneath them. "Back again? I thought we made it clear," Liam said, his voice as slick as oil. "This isn't the kind of place you just wander around in." Mason met his gaze without blinking. "I'm not here to wander." Mason's voice was calm but firm. Liam leaned in slightly, lowering his voice though the malice still dripped from every word. "These planes aren't for browsing, Walker. They're for buying. And unless you've got something in that old truck of yours, I doubt you're doing much of either." Before Mason could respond, a new voice chimed in from the other side of the room. "Let him dream," someone jeered, louder than before. "That's probably all he's got." The room fell silent for a beat, as if everyone held their breath, waiting to see what Mason would do. His heart tightened in his chest, but his expression remained unmoved. The jeers came in waves, testing him, but Mason held firm, standing tall beneath the storm. Liam arched an eyebrow, clearly expecting Mason to walk away in defeat, but Mason stayed exactly where he was. He wasn't sure how to face the relentless judgment without sacrificing his dignity. The weight of their gazes felt like 1,000 needles pressing into his back, waiting for him to crumble. Suddenly, a hand rested gently on Mason's shoulder. The unexpected touch broke the tension coiling in his chest. He turned, and standing there was a familiar face, Derek Hayes, an old friend from his high school days. "Mason?" Derek's warm, rich voice broke through the heavy atmosphere like sunlight piercing through clouds. Derek's smile radiated ease, contrasting with the suffocating tension of the room. His neatly trimmed beard, sharp gray suit, and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to Mason's rugged attire. Mason blinked in surprise, his face softening for the first time that day. "Derek, is that really you?" Mason's lips tugged into a rare smile, something he hadn't shown since stepping into the showroom. Derek chuckled and pulled him into a firm hug. For a moment, the eyes around them didn't matter. Derek's presence was a reminder of home, of simpler, grounded times. "What are you doing here?" Derek asked, stepping back but keeping his hand on Mason's shoulder. His tone was light, teasing. "Don't tell me you're here to buy a plane." His eyes sparkled with humor, but there was no trace of doubt in his voice, just genuine curiosity and encouragement. Mason hesitated for a second. A flicker of embarrassment crossed his face. The difference between them felt stark. Derek looked like he belonged here, exuding confidence, while Mason felt like an intruder on someone else's stage. "Actually, yeah, I am," Mason admitted, voice steady but low. "But judging by the looks I've been getting, no one seems to believe that." Derek's expression shifted as he glanced around the showroom, his eyes narrowing slightly at the murmuring guests. "The people here?" Derek said with a quiet scoff. "Forget them. They don't know you. They don't know your story. And honestly, they don't matter." Mason gave a small nod, but the weight of the room still pressed on him. "You didn't hear what they were saying," Mason murmured, eyes flicking toward the reception desk, where a group of customers exchanged amused glances. "The insults. The way they look at me like I don't belong here." Derek placed a firm hand on Mason's shoulder, grounding him. "Mason," Derek said, locking eyes with him. "Remember who you are. You've worked harder than anyone I know to get here. Their words don't define your worth. And they sure as hell can't stop you from achieving what you've earned." Mason exhaled slowly, Derek's words weaving strength back into his spine. "And besides," Derek added with a grin, "I'm not about to let you give up now." The warmth of Derek's unwavering belief seeped into Mason's chest. For the first time since walking in, the tension within him began to loosen. As they continued talking, Mason noticed the air shift. The subtle tension that had filled the showroom hadn't vanished, it had merely redirected. Across the room, Liam Preston stood near the counter, arms crossed and eyes locked on them, with that same thin smirk. Liam's gaze lingered on Derek this time, displeasure flickering behind his eyes. "Looks like his friend wants to play the part too," Liam muttered to another associate loud enough for Mason and Derek to hear. A few nearby customers chuckled, the venom creeping back into the air. Mason's shoulders tensed again. He leaned slightly toward Derek, lowering his voice. "Sometimes, I wonder if it's even worth it." Mason admitted quietly, "It feels like a fight I can't win." Derek's eyes darkened, but his expression remained calm. "It's worth it," Derek said firmly. "No one gets to decide your dream except you. If you walk away now, they win. But if you stand your ground, you'll prove every one of them wrong." Mason's lips curved into a faint smile. Derek's presence was a shield, a reminder that Mason wasn't alone. Still, Liam's gaze trailed them, his smirk unwavering, as if waiting for the moment Mason would fold under the weight of it all. Mason clenched his fists at his side, not in anger, but as a reminder to hold his ground. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But with Derek standing beside him, Mason knew one thing for certain: he wasn't leaving that showroom without a fight. The walls of Riverside Aviation Showroom seemed to close in, suffocating him beneath layers of silent judgment. He was ready to leave until a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Do you think you can buy an airplane dressed like that?" The words echoed across the showroom, loud enough to draw the attention of nearly everyone nearby. Mason's steps slowed but didn't stop. His shoulders tensed, though he didn't immediately turn to face the voice. The man responsible, middle-aged, in a tailored gray suit and shoes so polished they gleamed under the lights, stood with his arms folded, a smug smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He hadn't just spoken to Mason, he'd made sure everyone heard him. "Look at you," the man continued, his tone thick with mockery. "You should head back to whatever farm you came from. This isn't the place for someone like you." A few chuckles broke the uneasy silence. Subtle, but loud enough to sting. Near the reception desk, a woman covered her mouth as if to hide her amusement, though the satisfaction in her eyes was evident. Others in the room exchanged glances, their smirks unhidden. The man's words fueled the atmosphere, emboldening the stares of those around Mason. Standing nearby, Derek Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his fists clenching at his sides. He took a step forward, ready to step in, but Mason raised a hand to stop him. This was his battle. Slowly, Mason turned, meeting the man's gaze with quiet steadiness. "If you have something to say to me, just say it," Mason said calmly, his voice cutting through the remaining laughter. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to still the room. The man's eyes flickered with brief surprise, but quickly regained their usual arrogance. "Straightforward, huh?" the man sneered. "Fine, I'll be blunt. You look completely out of place here. This is a space for people who can actually afford their dreams, not for daydreamers." A few nods of agreement came from nearby customers, as if the man had voiced what many of them had been thinking. By the counter, Liam Preston leaned against the glass display, arms crossed and lips twisted into his signature smirk. He said nothing but exuded silent approval, clearly entertained by the exchange. Derek, unable to hold back any longer, stepped forward and squared his shoulders. "I wasn't aware there was a dress code for ambition," Derek said, his voice cold and sharp. "Or is it just that you think you get to decide who's worthy of being here?" The man chuckled dismissively, though irritation flickered in his eyes. "Relax," the man replied with a shrug. "I'm just saying what everyone else is already thinking, and if you're his friend, it makes sense." His gaze swept over Derek, his condescension seeping deeper. "Maybe neither of you know where you are." Derek's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Mason stepped forward. "I know exactly where I am," Mason said, his voice low and deliberate, "and I don't need anyone's permission to be here." The weight of his words lingered, silencing even the faintest murmurs. The man hesitated for a brief moment, clearly not expecting Mason's calm defiance, but arrogance kept him rooted. "Oh, really?" the man sneered. "Then show us what you've got. Let's see if you're cut out for anything more than chasing dreams." Mason didn't answer right away. His eyes held the man's stare without wavering. Finally, Mason glanced at Derek. "Let's go," he said softly, his tone steady but firm. But inside him a fire burned, a quiet, unrelenting blaze of pride and determination. As Mason and Derek walked toward the exit, the room settled into a hush. It wasn't respect that filled the silence. It was anticipation, the sense that many were waiting for Mason to fail. Just as they reached the door, the man's voice rang out again, laced with derision. "Oh, leaving already?" the man called out. "I thought you'd at least try to prove something. Maybe I overestimated you after all." Mason froze mid-step. His hands clenched at his sides, and this time he couldn't let it slide. Turning slowly, Mason walked back toward the man with measured steps, each one deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath. "What exactly do you want me to prove?" Mason's voice was calm but carried an undeniable authority. His eyes locked onto the man's, brimming with confidence, free of hesitation. "I didn't come here to prove anything to you or anyone else in this room. I came to get what I deserve." The man's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he masked it with a dismissive shrug. "Nice speech," the man said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Mason Walker let a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't amusement. It was the smile of someone who had faced doubt countless times, but always found a way to rise above it. Slowly, he reached into the breast pocket of his worn flannel shirt and pulled out a folded check. The room, filled with murmurs and smug glances, fell silent as Mason held it high. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The number printed on the check matched the exact value of the jet Mason had been eyeing. The middle-aged man in the gray suit swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the check and Mason's steady, unwavering expression. Liam Preston, the cocky salesman, stood frozen behind the counter, his hand gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. The smugness drained from Liam's face, replaced by confusion and discomfort. Mason took another step forward, extending the check toward the man in the suit. "You're right," Mason said, his tone razor-sharp. "Talk doesn't buy anything, but money does, and I've got enough to make this dream real." The man opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mason lowered the check, letting his gaze sweep the room. One by one, the eyes that had once watched him with disdain now looked away, unable to meet his stare. "What any of you think doesn't matter to me," Mason continued, his voice gaining strength. "What matters is that I know exactly who I am and what I deserve. If anyone in this room believes I don't belong, maybe it's time to take a hard look at yourself." The weight of his words seemed to strike a nerve. Behind him, Derek Hayes smiled, pride shining in his eyes. Liam, visibly flustered, finally stepped forward in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Sir, perhaps there's been some misunderstanding," Liam stammered, his earlier arrogance replaced by nervousness. "If you're truly interested, we'd be more than happy to assist you." Mason turned to him, his gaze sharp as steel. "Misunderstanding?" Mason's voice cut through the air. "There's no misunderstanding. You knew exactly how you treated me from the moment I walked in. Let me make one thing clear. I don't need your help. I'll buy this plane from someone who knows how to treat their customers with respect." With that, Mason turned, walking away with slow, deliberate steps. The room behind him fell into awkward silence, the discomfort thick in the air. But inside Mason, a fire burned brighter than ever. He hadn't just stood up for himself. He had made it known that no one had the right to judge another's worth based on appearances. Mason stepped outside, the crisp afternoon air hitting his face as he walked toward his old pickup truck. But as he leaned against the hood, the weight of the moment lingered. The stares, the insults, they hung in his mind like shadows. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen for a long moment. Taking a deep breath, Mason dialed a familiar number. A few minutes later, a sleek black sedan rolled into the parking lot. Jordan Walker, Mason's son, stepped out. His tailored charcoal suit, polished leather shoes, and sharp tie gave him the look of someone who commanded respect wherever he went. Jordan's eyes scanned the front of the showroom before landing on Mason. "Dad." Jordan's voice was calm but firm as he approached, his broad shoulders cutting through the space between them. Mason straightened up, watching his son approach. "You all right?" Jordan asked, his tone low but filled with concern. Mason nodded faintly, but his silence said more than words could. Jordan's gaze shifted toward the glass doors of the showroom, where a few customers still lingered, casting quick glances in their direction. Liam, standing near the reception desk, avoided Jordan's eyes entirely. Without hesitation, Jordan strode into the showroom. The air shifted almost instantly. Curious stares quickly morphed into nervous ones. Jordan's footsteps echoed as he approached the reception desk, his gaze locked onto Liam, who now seemed to shrink behind the counter. "Are you the one in charge here?" Jordan's voice was calm, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Liam flinched, forcing a thin, uneasy smile. I'm just a sales associate," Liam stammered. "If you're looking for more information—" "That's enough," Jordan cut him off, his tone like ice. "You thought you could treat my father that way? Those words, those comments, weren't just rude, they were discriminatory, and I expect an apology, now." The tension in the room tightened, thick and unrelenting. Liam's gaze darted nervously to the other customers, but no one offered him support. Even the middle-aged man in the suit had quietly stepped back, the arrogance draining from his face. "Listen," Liam started, his voice faltering. "I didn't mean any harm. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding." Jordan's stare hardened. "A misunderstanding?" Jordan repeated slowly, his voice like a hammer striking steel. "Disrespect isn't a misunderstanding. You judged my father because of how he looked. You thought you had the right to decide who belongs here. I'm telling you now, you didn't." Liam swallowed, beads of sweat forming at his brow. Jordan took a step closer. "If you don't apologize right now, I'll make sure this doesn't just end with words. I'm a lawyer, and what happened here today? That's discrimination, and I will pursue legal action if necessary." The room held its breath. Liam's face paled. Finally, with visible reluctance, Liam lowered his head slightly. I apologize, sir. If my words offended you, that wasn't my intention." Mason met Liam's eyes from across the room. His expression was calm, steady. "That apology isn't just for me," Mason said firmly. "It's a lesson for you and everyone else here. Learn how to treat people with respect, no matter what they look like." Jordan glanced around the room, letting his gaze settle on each person who had laughed or whispered. "Remember this," Jordan said quietly. "Respect is earned by how you treat others, not by how much you own." Jordan Walker's gaze hardened, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone sharp. "You thought you had the right to look down on my father because of how he dressed? That's the misunderstanding?" Liam Preston, the once confident salesman, froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Around him, the other customers who had chuckled and whispered avoided Jordan's piercing stare, shifting uncomfortably. The room seemed to shrink beneath the weight of Jordan's words. "If I don't hear an apology right now," Jordan continued, his voice unwavering, "I won't let this slide. I'm a lawyer, and this wasn't just an insult. It was blatant discrimination in a public business. If necessary, I will take legal action against you and this company." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, but no one dared to challenge him. Liam's face paled. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he swallowed hard, glancing around for support that didn't come. Finally, with visible reluctance, Liam lowered his head slightly. "Sir?" Liam's voice trembled. "I apologize if my words offended you." Mason Walker met Liam's eyes, calm and steady. "This apology isn't for me," Mason said firmly. "It's a lesson for you and everyone here. Respect isn't something you offer based on appearances. It's something you give to everyone, no matter where they come from." Jordan stood beside his father, his gaze still sharp as steel. He turned slowly, letting his eyes drift over the group of customers who had mocked Mason earlier. "What about you?" Jordan asked, his tone heavy. "Did you think you had the right to laugh at him just because he doesn't look like you?" No one spoke. The middle-aged man in the gray suit, who had been the loudest, shifted uncomfortably. He mumbled something incoherent under his breath and quickly lowered his head, avoiding Jordan's gaze. A few others awkwardly shuffled toward the exit, eager to escape the uncomfortable scene. Jordan placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Let's go, Dad," he said quietly. "They've seen enough." But even as they left, Jordan's resolve burned brightly. This wasn't just about his father. It was about something deeper. Something he wouldn't let pass quietly. A few weeks later, a lawsuit was filed against Riverside Aviation, accusing the company of discriminatory practices and the public humiliation of Mason Walker. Jordan led the legal team, meticulously crafting the case with undeniable evidence, witnesses, and a powerful argument. The first hearing drew significant attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and community leaders. Representatives of Riverside Aviation sat at the defense table, including Liam Preston, whose face now lacked the smugness he once carried. Jordan rose, stepping confidently toward the center of the room. His gaze swept across the courtroom as he began his opening statement. "Your Honor," Jordan began, his voice calm yet commanding, "we are here today to expose a harsh truth, a truth that is often overlooked or dismissed. Discrimination is not a relic of the past. It exists and it thrives, even in places where fairness and professionalism should prevail." He glanced briefly at his father, seated quietly at the front. "My father, Mason Walker, was subjected to more than just unkind words that day. He faced open prejudice, humiliation, and an environment that tolerated such behavior, and no one should have to endure that." A lawyer representing Riverside Aviation quickly stood. "Objection, Your Honor," the defense interrupted. "We believe this case is being exaggerated. The remarks Mr. Walker overheard were harmless, misunderstandings, not intentional acts of discrimination." Jordan's expression didn't flinch. "Misunderstandings?" Jordan repeated, turning to the defense. "Let's examine that." He motioned toward a young woman seated nearby. Patricia Green, a former employee at Riverside Aviation, stepped forward to take the witness stand. "Patricia," Jordan began softly, "can you recount what you witnessed that day?" Patricia took a deep breath, her eyes flickering nervously toward Liam, who now slouched in his seat. "I saw everything," Patricia said firmly. "Liam and several customers mocked Mr. Walker because of his appearance. They assumed he didn't belong there. I recorded the incident because I couldn't stand by and watch it happen." Jordan nodded, a small, confident smile forming. "Do you still have that recording?" he asked. Patricia handed over her phone. Jordan connected it to the courtroom's audio system. As the recording played, the courtroom fell into heavy silence. Liam's voice echoed through the room, cold and unmistakable. "You think you can afford a plain dress like that? Go back to your farm." The courtroom tensed as the insults and laughter of the customers filled the air. Each word landed like a hammer blow, undeniable and clear. When the recording ended, Jordan turned back to the judge. "This isn't just about misunderstandings, Your Honor. This is about a culture of discrimination, a culture that this company allowed to exist. And today, we are asking for accountability." The defense lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but struggled to counter the damning evidence. The judge's gaze hardened as she looked at the defense table. "The evidence is compelling," she said firmly. "We will proceed with this case to determine the full extent of the company's responsibility." Jordan returned to his seat beside Mason, offering his father a quiet, reassuring smile. "This isn't just about the plane, Dad," Jordan whispered. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Mason nodded, pride reflected in his eyes, and as the hearing continued, one thing became clear. Jordan Walker wasn't just fighting for his father. He was fighting for dignity, justice, and the right for everyone to be treated with respect. Jordan Walker stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he began, his eyes sharp and unrelenting. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is discrimination, a direct attack on my father's dignity. And let me be clear, he isn't the only one at risk. Anyone who doesn't fit their mold of the ideal customer could easily become a target." The company's lawyer rose quickly, trying to contain the damage. "We acknowledge that the remarks were inappropriate," the attorney said, adjusting his tie. "However, the company cannot be held accountable for individual actions. These comments were not sanctioned, nor do they reflect company policy." Jordan's gaze narrowed like a laser cutting through the weak defense. "The company can't evade responsibility," Jordan said, his tone controlled yet razor-sharp. "This isn't about one salesperson's behavior. It's about the environment the company fosters, an environment that tolerates and excuses such conduct. If the company doesn't take responsibility, then who will?" The judge, an older woman with a commanding presence, leaned forward slightly. She nodded slowly, her eyes flicking toward the defense table. "The evidence is very clear," she said gravely. "We will proceed to assess the full extent of the company's and the individual's responsibilities. But I must say, what I've heard so far is deeply troubling." A quiet murmur rippled across the courtroom. Jordan glanced at his father, Mason Walker, sitting calmly in the front row. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Mason gave a small nod of pride, a silent acknowledgement of his son's strength. But Jordan knew this fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning. As the recording of the showroom incident continued to play, each word sliced through the heavy silence like a blade. "Go back to your farm." "He probably thinks this is a giveaway." The courtroom atmosphere grew thick with tension. The recording left little room for denial. Mason sat quietly, his hands clenched tightly on his lap, though his face betrayed no emotion. But Jordan could see the tension in his father's posture, the quiet restraint he had always admired. On the witness stand, Patricia Green took a deep breath. "These words aren't just offensive," Patricia said, her voice steady. "They reflect the exact attitude Mr. Walker faced the moment he stepped into the showroom. I worked there. I saw it firsthand. This is the truth, and it happens regularly to people they think don't belong." Across the room, Riverside Aviation's legal team shifted uncomfortably. One of the company's lawyers, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, while we do not deny the remarks made, we contend this was the action of one employee. It does not represent the company's overall values or policies." Jordan's eyes darkened. He rose to his feet immediately. "Does not represent the company?" Jordan repeated, his voice calm but powerful. "Let me remind the court, Greg wasn't alone in making those remarks. The recording makes it clear that other staff members, and even customers, encouraged and laughed along with him. This isn't isolated. This is systemic." The defense lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but Jordan pressed forward. "Training isn't enough," Jordan said, his gaze cutting through the defense table. My father isn't the first to be treated this way. And unless significant actions are taken, he won't be the last. This company must be held accountable, not just for the words spoken, but for the silence that allowed it to happen. The room fell into an uneasy stillness. Finally, the judge leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. The evidence presented clearly demonstrates that Mr. Walker was subjected to discriminatory treatment, she said, her voice stern. This cannot be dismissed as an individual incident. The company has a responsibility to ensure a fair and inclusive business environment. She fixed the company's attorneys with a steady gaze. I advise the defense to reconsider its position, she added, her tone carrying the weight of expectation. Would you like to continue arguing, or is the company willing to discuss a reasonable settlement? The defense team conferred hurriedly, their concern evident. But Jordan wasn't finished. Your Honor, Jordan said firmly, stepping forward again, I want to make something clear. We are not here for superficial apologies or empty promises of better training. My father's dignity was stripped from him in that showroom, and we are here to ensure this never happens again. The defense lawyer rose reluctantly, his face pale. We are willing to discuss settlement terms, he said quietly, his previous confidence shaken. The judge nodded. Good. We will proceed with settlement discussions, but let me be clear. If this matter is not resolved appropriately, I will see it through to trial, and I expect full accountability. Jordan turned to Mason, offering him a faint but reassuring smile. This is just the start, Dad, Jordan said, his voice soft yet resolute. Mason's eyes gleamed with quiet pride. I know, son. I know. Jordan Walker stood firm, his voice unwavering as he addressed the court. My father didn't come here for a token apology or superficial training measures. He came to reclaim the respect and dignity that were taken from him, and we won't stop until justice is fully served. The courtroom held its breath. Liam Preston sat motionless at the defense table, his face pale, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The company's lawyers exchanged hurried whispers, their earlier confidence now replaced with unease. Finally, one of them rose, his voice subdued. Your Honor, we are willing to discuss settlement terms. The judge nodded. Good, we will proceed with settlement discussions in the next session. But let me make one thing clear. If a satisfactory resolution is not reached, this case will go to trial, and I will ensure justice is served. Jordan turned to his father, Mason Walker, his voice lowering as he smiled faintly. We're on the right track, Dad, he whispered, his eyes filled with quiet pride. But this isn't over yet. Mason met his son's gaze with a nod, the corner of his mouth lifting ever so slightly. The final verdict. The final day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community leaders, and curious onlookers. Rows of seats were filled, and the air hummed with anticipation. The case had captured public attention, far beyond the showroom floor where it had all begun. Mason and Jordan sat side by side, their expressions calm but resolute. They knew that today would be pivotal. The judge entered, her sharp gaze sweeping over the room as she settled at the bench. After a few moments of quiet, she began delivering the verdict. Members of the court, after thoroughly reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from all parties, I have reached my conclusion. The room fell silent. Mr. Mason Walker has endured severe discrimination in a public business setting. The recorded statements presented in this court were not only offensive but exposed a culture of disrespect and tolerance for misconduct within Riverside Aviation. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. This behavior violates fundamental principles of fair business practices and directly contravenes existing laws regarding human rights and anti-discrimination. The defense team lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact with the judge. Liam Preston, who had sat at the heart of the controversy, stared blankly at the table. His once smug demeanor had dissolved entirely. In the gallery, a few of the customers who had joined in the ridicule shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge's tone sharpened. Therefore, I declare Riverside Aviation responsible for acts of discrimination and harassment against Mr. Walker. The company is ordered to pay a fine of $500,000. A ripple of murmur spread through the room. It was a significant penalty, one that would leave a lasting mark on the company's operations and reputation. This sum will serve as compensation to Mr. Walker and will fund programs aimed at promoting equality and combating discrimination in the workplace. But the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, she continued, her gaze locking onto the company's representatives, Riverside Aviation will implement mandatory anti-discrimination and equality training for all employees. This will be overseen by an independent body to ensure compliance and effectiveness. Jordan's lips pressed together in quiet satisfaction. This was the change he had hoped for. Not just financial reparation, but a cultural shift within the company. The judge's final words rang clear. Finally, Riverside Aviation will issue a public apology to Mr. Walker. This apology must be made in writing and shared across public platforms. A public acknowledgement is not just about righting the specific wrong, it is a critical step toward rebuilding trust and integrity. The room fell still once more, the rustling of papers the only sound as the judge concluded. This court is adjourned. With a firm strike of the gavel, it was done. As the courtroom emptied, Mason turned to his son, his voice soft but full of emotion. You did it. Jordan placed a steady hand on his father's shoulder, his eyes gleaming with determination. This is justice, Dad. Across the room, Liam Preston quietly slipped out, his face ashen and eyes downcast. The company's legal team packed their materials in silence, the weight of the verdict pressing down on them. This wasn't just a ruling, it was a costly lesson etched into the foundation of Riverside Aviation. A new beginning. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight seemed brighter. A throng of reporters quickly gathered around Mason and Jordan, cameras flashing and microphones extending toward them. Mason raised a hand gently, signaling for calm. I didn't fight this battle for myself alone, Mason said, his voice steady. I fought for everyone who has ever felt judged or dismissed because of how they look, where they come from, or what they wear. Today was about more than a plane, it was about dignity. Jordan stepped forward, adding with quiet confidence, this case isn't just about my father's experience. It's a reminder that respect and fairness are not privileges, they are rights, and no one should be made to feel lesser for simply chasing their dreams. The crowd of reporters nodded, the weight of those words settling in. As Mason and Jordan walked down the courthouse steps together, the battle may have ended, but the impact of their stand rippled far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The morning sunlight glinted off the polished surfaces of private jets lined up outside Blue Ridge Aviation, casting long reflections across the tarmac. Mason Walker stepped out of a sleek black SUV, the leather of his tailored suit catching the light. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, each step echoing with quiet authority. Mason was no longer the man who had walked into this showroom years ago, clad in muddy boots and a faded flannel shirt. He carried himself differently now, each stride a silent proclamation that he had risen above the ridicule, the prejudice, and the whispers of doubt that once filled this very space. Beside him, Jordan Walker matched his pace, his expression calm yet proud. Mason could feel his son's unspoken pride radiating beside him. As Mason entered the showroom, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed, and the employees who had once mocked him froze. Their eyes flickered uncertainly, unsure of where to land. Behind the counter, Liam Preston, the man who had led the charge in belittling Mason, now stood with his shoulders slightly hunched. His arrogance had faded, replaced by unease as his gaze briefly met Mason's before darting away. Mason walked deliberately to the center of the room, stopping in front of Liam and a few other employees. His eyes swept over them, calm yet carrying an unmistakable confidence. A faint smile tugged at Mason's lips. It wasn't one of forgiveness, rather, it was the quiet smile of victory. Do you remember me? Mason's deep, steady voice filled the space. The question lingered, pressing down on the room like a weight. No one answered, but the hesitant nods and averted eyes said enough. The last time I left this place, Mason continued, his voice measured, you laughed. You mocked me and judged me by the dirt on my boots and the way I dressed. His gaze locked onto Liam. But today, I'm not here to buy a plane from you. I'm here to remind you that prejudices like yours cannot diminish anyone's worth. Liam opened his mouth to respond, but Mason raised a hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. I don't need an apology, Mason said firmly. The court has already spoken on my behalf. What I want is for you to remember this. Every person who walks through that door deserves respect, no matter how they look or where they come from. Mason turned away, his eyes settling on another display area featuring the sleek jets of a rival aviation company. The competitor's logo gleamed under the overhead lights, bold and untarnished by the weight of past insults. "Let's go," Mason said softly, glancing at Jordan. Father and son walked across the showroom, toward the rival brand's section. A young salesperson greeted them with a polite smile and genuine respect, as if Mason's past didn't matter, only the person standing in front of them did. "I'd like to see your finest models," Mason said, his tone professional but firm. There was no doubt he was a man capable of making significant decisions. From behind the counter, Liam and his colleagues could only watch, their expressions a blend of regret and embarrassment. Liam's hands tightened around the counter's edge, as if realizing, perhaps too late, that his arrogance had cost more than just a sale. An hour later, Mason and Jordan stepped out of the rival company's showroom, a signed contract in hand. Mason had finally acquired the plane he once dreamed of, but the true victory lay in how he had done it, on his own terms, without bowing to prejudice. As they made their way back to the SUV, Mason paused for a moment and glanced toward the old showroom. Liam and his co-workers stood like shadows, burdened by the weight of their own regret. Mason gave them a brief, fleeting smile. Not out of malice, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the lesson they would carry long after he was gone. He turned away, leaving behind the space that once sought to diminish him. In the skies above, Mason's new plane soared, cutting smoothly through the clouds. The gleaming fuselage bore the logo of the rival company, one that had treated him with the respect he had always deserved. Seated inside the cabin, Mason gazed out of the window, watching the landscape stretch out far below. His heart swelled, not with pride in the plane itself, but with the fulfillment of overcoming what once seemed insurmountable. Beside him, Jordan sat quietly, staring ahead with the calm satisfaction of someone who had fought alongside his father every step of the way. The plane dipped lower, preparing to land on the familiar fields near their family's property. As the aircraft touched down, Mason saw his family waiting near the hangar, his wife, children, and grandchildren, their smiles beaming with pride. The door opened and Mason stepped out to greet them. His wife approached first, taking his hand in hers, her eyes gleaming with admiration. "You did it," she whispered softly. Mason's hand squeezed hers gently. "We did it," he replied. Their children rushed forward, wrapping their arms around Mason. In their eyes, Mason wasn't just the man who had bought a jet. He was the father and grandfather who had shown them the meaning of perseverance, dignity, and the quiet power of standing tall in the face of adversity. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mason's family gathered around the dining table. The air was filled with laughter, warmth, and the hum of shared stories. Mason sat at the head of the table, reflecting on the long journey that had brought him here. "Remember," he said, his voice calm yet full of conviction, "no one has the right to define your worth except you. And no matter the obstacles, never stop reaching for what you deserve." Jordan raised his glass in a silent toast, the reflection of his father's strength shining in his eyes. And as Mason looked around the table at his family, he knew the lesson would carry on, for generations to come. That evening, the Walker family gathered around their long oak dining table, the soft glow of the chandelier casting warm light over the room. The atmosphere wasn't just one of celebration, it was filled with the quiet acknowledgement of Mason Walker's journey. His dream of owning a plane had come true, but the true triumph was far greater than that. As Mason sat at the head of the table, his wife, Evelyn, gently placed her hand over his. Her eyes shimmered with admiration and love. "You did it," she whispered, her voice carrying a soft tremor of pride. Mason gave her hand a small squeeze, the corners of his mouth lifting. His children, dressed in neat attire, surrounded him, their excitement evident as they called his name with reverence and joy. His grandchildren hugged his legs, grinning up at him as if he were larger than life. Later that evening, as plates were cleared and the conversation quieted, Mason's voice broke the stillness. "I'm not a perfect man," Mason began, his gaze meeting each of his family members. "But I've always believed one thing. No one has the right to define our worth except ourselves. This wasn't just about buying a plane. It was about standing up for what's right and proving that we can rise above prejudice if we refuse to give up. Jordan sat beside his father, listening intently. After a brief pause, he added, "Justice doesn't just happen. We have to stand for it, fight for it, and never let injustice go unanswered." Mason nodded quietly, his eyes reflecting the wisdom earned from the long road behind him. Elsewhere, the antagonists of Mason's story were not left unchanged. Liam Preston, once full of arrogance and certainty, was no longer employed at Riverside Aviation. The company, having faced steep fines and intense public scrutiny, was forced to overhaul its policies from the ground up. Strict anti-discrimination training was implemented, and oversight became the new standard. For some, the courtroom ruling wasn't just a corporate policy change. It was a humbling experience. Customers who had laughed at Mason now carried with them a lingering sense of shame. The casual smirks and condescending remarks that once seemed harmless left an imprint they couldn't ignore. Mason's story had rippled far beyond the showroom floor. But for Mason, this was never about revenge or humiliation. As he sat by the window of his newly purchased plane, watching the sky stretch endlessly before him, Mason's heart felt lighter than it had in years. The aircraft was more than just a mode of transport. It was a symbol, a testament to the power of perseverance, dignity, and self-respect. Jordan sat across from him, quietly gazing at the horizon. "I never thought I'd see this day," Mason admitted, his voice soft as he stared out the window. Jordan smiled. "Neither did they," he replied with a quiet chuckle. As the plane glided through the clouds, Mason closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines wash over him. This wasn't just his victory. It was a reminder for anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. The sky was limitless. Mason Walker's story wasn't just about buying an airplane. It became a beacon, a reminder that standing against prejudice, no matter how small or grand the moment, holds the power to inspire change. His fight wasn't just for himself. It was for every person who had ever felt voiceless in the face of injustice. As Mason soared through the azure sky, he carried not just the realization of a dream, but the unwavering pride of a man who had proven that determination and self-worth can break any barrier. How would you have responded in Mason's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.